Hi, this is Mrs. Allen, and in this video we will be talking about choosing your sample size. The question of how large a sample to take is an important step in planning any study, so let's look at an example. So suppose we have a candidate who is planning a poll and wants to estimate voter support within 3% with 95% confidence. How large of a sample does he need to take? So first we need to look at the margin of error. So let's look at our margin of error equation and fill in what we know from the question. So we want to know within 3%, so our margin of error would be 3%, so we would plug in 0.03. Next, they want to know with 95% confidence, so our critical value from the normal model for 95% confidence would be 1.96. So we can go ahead and plug in both of those things. Now, often we have an estimate of the population proportion based on experience or perhaps a previous study. So if they give that to us, we could plug that in. But here, they do not. So if not, the cautious approach is to use 0.5 or 50% in the sample size calculation. That will determine the largest sample necessary regardless of the true population. So for our sample proportion, we can go ahead and plug in 0.5. And remember our Q hat is just 1 minus the sample proportion, so we can plug in our 0.5 here and subtract. And our Q is also 0.5. So we can go ahead and plug that in. Now we are just left with the N, the sample size, which what we're trying to solve for. So now we can solve for N. Okay, so to do that, first we need to multiply both sides of the equation by the square root of N. That way we can eliminate it on the right side. So we can go ahead and cross that out. And this is what we are left with. So to get N by itself, now we should divide both sides by 0.03. So, which will eliminate it on the left side. And we are left with this. Okay, so if you use your calculator and calculate what's on the right, we get the square root of N is roughly 32.67. So to get rid of a square root, we square both sides, and our answer is 1067.1. When computing sample size, we always round up to ensure the confidence level we want and conclude that we need at least 1068 responses to keep the margin of error as small as 3% with a confidence level of 95%. So let's look at another example here. So we have a poll now that estimated that 40% of all voters believe that scientists disagree about whether global warming exists, and it had a margin error of plus or minus 3%. So suppose an environmental group planning a follow-up survey of the voters' opinions on global warming wanted to determine a 95% confidence interval with a margin error of no more than plus or minus 2%. So how large of a sample did they need? So let's look at this example. So again, we're going to start with our margin of error equation. And they told us our margin of error was 2%. So we could go ahead and plug that in. Again, we want 95% for our confidence interval, so our critical value would be 1.96, which is right here. And this time, we're not going to use 50% because they told us 40% in a previous poll. So we'll use the 40% for our sample proportion, and 1 minus 40% would give us 60%, so we could use 0.6 for our Q hat. So now we are ready to solve for N. So we multiply both sides by the square root of N and then divide by 0.02, and we are left with this equation, which gives us roughly 48.01. And if we get rid of the square root by squaring both sides, we get 2,304.96, and we need to round up. So they would need to poll 2,305 people. Okay, so let's try one on your own. So in a study on marriage and family, 4% of randomly selected people said that the trend of more single women having children is a good thing. How many people would need to be surveyed for 95% confidence interval to ensure the margin of error would be less than 3%? Okay, so pause the video, try this one out on your own, and when you're ready to check your answers, restart the video. Okay, so let's look at the problem. First, we'll start with our equation, margin of error. And they told us the margin of error they want is 3%, so we would plug in 0.03. They want to do it with a 95% confidence interval, so our critical value is 1.96. And the sample proportion was 4%, so we would plug in 0.04. Multiplying that by our Q hat, which is 0.96, and now we can solve for n. Multiplying both sides by the square root of n and dividing by 0.03 will leave us with this equation right here. And then when we square 12.8, we get 163.84. Rounding up, we would need to survey 164 people. Thank you for watching this video. Hope it makes it a little bit more clear about choosing a sample size.